still, the calmness of the neighborhood starkly contrasting the tension building within the Chanowitz household. Tracy smiled as she received a message from her husband Christopher, asking her to meet him in the garage. He had a surprise for her. She had no reason to be suspicious. After all, Christopher had always been affectionate, even playful at times. "Ready for your surprise?" he asked, voice light with a hint of mischief, as he guided her gently toward the garage. Tracy laughed, her heart warm with excitement. They'd been through so much together, a steady rhythm of day-to-day life with moments of joy sprinkled in. She trusted him, but tonight, something felt different. Tracy couldn't quite put her finger on it. Christopher's silence, the way he moved, slightly too calm for her liking, began to gnaw at her. She dismissed it. After all, it was just a surprise, right? When they reached the garage, he blindfolded her. "Just a little longer," he said, and though she was confused by the delay, she complied, letting him lead her by the hand. The garage door creaked as they entered, and the air was thick with an unsettling stillness. "Are you excited?" he asked, his voice sounding far too steady. Tracy chuckled, thinking it was all just part of the game. "Of course," she replied, trying to keep the mood light. But as he stepped behind her, she felt a tightening around her neck, a sensation that jolted her out of her calm. It wasn't the blindfold, but something else. Something was wrong. She tried to pull away. "What is this?" Her voice trembled slightly, but Christopher only laughed softly, too softly, as though he were controlling everything around her. He tightened the knot around her neck, her breath caught. Suddenly, everything changed. The knot wasn't just a playful tie. It was real. It was tight. Christopher was trying to hang her. Tracy's heart raced as panic flooded her veins. She clawed at the rope, trying to breathe, trying to break free from the suffocating grip he had on her. She managed to pull off the blindfold, her mind racing as the sight of Christopher, calm and distant, came into focus. He wasn't laughing anymore. He wasn't joking. His face was cold, unreadable, as if he were watching a movie detached from the horror unfolding in front of him. "Stop!" Tracy gasped, her voice cracking. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze met hers, dark and resolute. "I'm ending this," he finally said. "You never really knew me." The words hit her harder than the rope ever could. Christopher wasn't the man she thought he was. The realization shattered her. In that moment, every question about their marriage, every lingering doubt she had pushed aside came crashing down. Tracy's instincts kicked in. She fought with every ounce of strength she had, pulling away from the rope. Her vision blurred with the exertion, but her determination kept her moving, even as her world spun. The rope loosened, and she broke free, stumbling backward. She gasped for air, her chest heaving as she scrambled away from him. Christopher stood still, watching her, not moving an inch. There was no regret in his eyes, no panic, just cold detachment. It was then that Tracy understood. This wasn't an accident, this was planned. He had made up his mind. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. He took a step toward her, the sound of his boots on the concrete echoing like a death knell. "Because I have to. Because you're in the way." Tracy's legs shook beneath her, but she forced herself to stand tall, despite the overwhelming terror that gripped her. She couldn't let him see how much she was falling apart inside. Her pulse raced, and she made a split-second decision. She turned and ran, her feet barely touching the ground as she sprinted toward the door. The garage door banged open behind her as she burst into the night, her breath ragged with fear. She didn't know where she was going, just that she needed to get out. She needed help. As she stumbled into the house, her thoughts scattered. Tracy grabbed the phone with trembling hands and dialed the one person she could trust. "Kelly." "Kelly," Tracy gasped. "He tried to kill me. I need you now." Tracy's heart was still racing as she stumbled backward, her legs shaking with every step. Her mind struggled to catch up with what had just happened. Christopher, her husband, the man she'd trusted for years, had just tried to kill her. The terror coursing through her veins felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's nightmare unfold. But this was no dream. She looked back at him, standing in the same place, his gaze locked on her with eerie calmness. There was no remorse, no desperation, just cold detachment. His eyes seemed to pierce right through her as though she were nothing more than an obstacle to be discarded. "You're in the way," he had said. Tracy's breath was shallow, her body still buzzing with the fear of what had just happened. The rope, the noose, it had all felt like a twisted game. But there was nothing playful in Christopher's actions. No joke, no laughter, just chilling intent. Her body was trembling, but her mind was already starting to process what needed to happen next. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let him get away with it. But she couldn't stop her feet from moving, away from him, away from the house. A deep, guttural scream tore through her throat, but it was silenced by the weight of the realization that this nightmare wasn't over. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about understanding who Christopher had become, what he was willing to do. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands, dialing Kelly's number in a panic. "Kelly," her voice broke as she spoke. "He tried to kill me. You need to get here. Please, now." Tracy's mind spun as she ended the call. Her chest felt tight, and every breath came with a forceful pull as she tried to calm herself enough to think. She couldn't just flee the house and hide forever. She had to stand up for herself to ensure this man, her husband, wouldn't harm anyone else. But she wasn't ready for what he'd said next. "I'll be waiting for you," Christopher had called after her, his voice filled with something Tracy couldn't quite place. Was it mockery? Or was it an admission of his own conviction? The words sent a chill down her spine, even though she knew the door had already slammed between them. Tracy wiped the sweat from her forehead as she quickly ran through her thoughts. Where would she go? What could she do? Her body was still shaking with adrenaline, but she knew she couldn't leave the house without some sort of backup. Kelly would be here soon, and that thought anchored her, just barely. The back door slammed open, and Tracy's legs gave way beneath her as she collapsed onto the floor, clutching her phone tightly. Her thoughts went to Kelly, how she was always there when Tracy needed her most. She knew her sister would arrive in time, but she also knew that the weight of what she'd just escaped would be etched into her memory forever. The sheer brutality of Christopher's actions was beyond anything she had ever imagined. This wasn't just a momentary lapse of judgment. This was something far darker, deeper. Suddenly, Tracy's phone buzzed. It was a text from Kelly. "I'm on my way. Hold on." That was the spark Tracy needed. She would hold on. She had to, not just for herself, but for the truth to be known, for justice to be served. Christopher couldn't walk away from this. He couldn't go unpunished. But as the seconds ticked by, Tracy's mind returned to the garage, his hands around her throat, the silence in the air, and his chilling words. "You're in the way." No, this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Her legs finally gave in and she sank to the floor, gasping for breath, waiting for Kelly to arrive. But Tracy was no longer the same woman who walked into that garage just moments ago. She had faced death, and she had survived. Now there would be no turning back. Tracy's chest heaved as she stumbled through the door, barely able to steady herself. Her hands were trembling, her mind racing to process what had just happened. Christopher's cold, emotionless face was burned into her memory, his words echoing in her head. "You're in the way." She didn't have time to think. Kelly would be here soon, but she couldn't just wait around. Tracy could still feel the phantom grip of the rope around her neck, her body still tingling with the shock of it all. Her heart thudded in her chest, but fear quickly morphed into something else. Survival. She needed to survive. And she would. Tracy darted across the house, her footsteps muffled on the carpeted floor, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Christopher's words kept repeating in her mind, a constant reminder that he wasn't just playing a cruel prank. He had tried to kill her. She hadn't been imagining it. The silence, the noose, the calculated way he had lowered it around her neck, it was all part of a plan that had almost succeeded. The sharp sound of the front door opening sent a chill down her spine, but it was only the wind. She breathed deeply, trying to calm herself. She had to stay focused. She needed a weapon, something to defend herself. Her gaze swept across the room, landing on the kitchen drawer. She bolted toward it, her fingers frantically pulling at the handle. It was locked. "No," she whispered to herself, frustration bubbling up. She slammed her fist into the wood, but then her eyes caught something more pressing. The kitchen knife. It was small, but it would have to do. Grabbing it, Tracy felt the weight of it in her hand, a strange comfort despite the horror that surrounded her. Her breath slowed, and she tried to steady her nerves, but the panic was still there. Her mind raced. How would she explain this to Kelly? How would she tell her that her own husband had been ready to end her life, that their entire world had just come crashing down in one horrifying moment? The thought of facing Kelly, of seeing the shock and disbelief in her sister's eyes, made her want to curl into herself, but there was no time for that. She couldn't let herself break down. Not now. Suddenly, a noise from behind her froze her in place. A footstep, and then another. Her blood ran cold. It was Christopher. He had followed her into the house. Tracy's heart pounded in her chest, the knife shaking slightly in her hand. She backed up slowly, trying to keep a safe distance between herself and the door leading to the garage. She could hear him moving closer, but there was no sound of him calling out, no words, just the steady rhythm of his steps. "Tracy," he called, his voice low and calm. It sent a shiver down her spine. He sounded almost detached, as though this was all a normal conversation. "Christopher, don't," she said, her voice cracking with fear. "Stay away from me." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, but her fear was obvious, betraying her every intention to stay strong. She gripped the knife tightly, feeling the weight of it, her knuckles white from the tension. She had to be brave. She couldn't let him win. Another step. Then he appeared in the doorway, his face eerily calm, just as it had been in the garage. There was no anger, no desperation in his eyes, only a cold, unfeeling emptiness. "I thought we were past this, Tracy," he said, taking another step forward. "You should have known better." She felt the panic creeping in again, but she swallowed it down. "You tried to kill me," she spat, the words bitter in her mouth. "You're not the man I married. I'm done with you." Christopher didn't flinch. He didn't react. His eyes locked onto hers, unblinking. "You're still not getting it, are you?" His voice was strangely calm, almost pitying. "This is the only way. You're in the way, and I can't let you keep holding me back." Tracy's heart raced as he advanced once more, but this time she was ready. She stepped backward, the knife still in her hand, her eyes never leaving him. "Stay back, Christopher, stay the hell back!" But Christopher only smiled. "You think you can stop me with that? It's over." It wasn't over. Not for her, not yet. The moment she heard Kelly's voice calling from the front door, Tracy ran. She didn't hesitate. The knife dropped from her hand, clattering to the floor as she bolted toward the door. "Kelly!" she screamed, her voice hoarse with emotion. "Help me!" In the house felt thick with tension, almost suffocating. Tracy stood frozen in the living room, still gripping the edge of the doorway, as Christopher's cold, unflinching gaze bore into her. Her body trembled with the weight of what had just happened. The near-death experience, the struggle to escape, and now, the confrontation with the man she once loved. Her heart raced in her chest, as if it could explode at any moment. She was alive, but she was also facing the terrifying truth of who her husband really was. Christopher's voice broke the silence, soft and almost indifferent. "I didn't want it to come to this, you know." Tracy's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure if it was disbelief or rage that overwhelmed her first. "What do you mean, come to this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "What do you think you were doing in that garage? Trying to kill me wasn't a mistake, Christopher. It was a choice." For a moment, there was nothing but the faint sound of her breathing and Christopher's quiet, controlled movements. He seemed almost relaxed, as if the entire ordeal had been just another part of a twisted plan, not the violent attempt on his wife's life. His lips curled into something like a smile, but it wasn't one of affection or remorse. It was cold, calculated, like someone who had already made peace with their actions. "You don't understand," Christopher said slowly, his voice steady, devoid of emotion. "I didn't want to do this to you, but you were in the way. You've always been in the way." Her stomach twisted. The words didn't make sense, couldn't make sense. But as she looked at him, Tracy realized there was no more pretending. The man she had married, the man she had trusted with everything, was gone. In his place stood a stranger, a man who saw her as nothing more than a problem to be solved. "How long?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "How long, Christopher? How long have you been lying to me? About everything?" Christopher didn't flinch. He didn't even seem surprised by the question. 6 years, he said, as if it was something trivial, something easily shrugged off. "I've been with her for 6 years, and we have a child together." Tracy's knees buckled beneath her, and she gripped the edge of the doorframe for support. 6 years. All those years of marriage, all the shared moments, the promises, they had been built on a lie. The man she had loved, the father of her children, had been living a double life. The betrayal was deep, searing through her like a wound that refused to heal. "You were never enough, Tracy," he continued, almost as if explaining himself. "You didn't give me what I needed. I had to find it elsewhere." Tracy felt the sting of his words, the rawness of his truth cutting through her. The feeling of betrayal, the hollow ache in her chest, grew sharper. But she wouldn't cry. Not here, not now, not in front of him. "And you thought killing me was the answer?" Tracy spat, anger finally pushing through her grief. "You thought it would solve everything? That you could just get rid of me like I was nothing?" Christopher's face darkened. "You don't get it, do you? He took a step closer to her, his expression almost pitying. I couldn't risk you finding out. I couldn't risk losing her and the life I've built with her. You were just a complication. The finality of his words hit her harder than any punch could. A complication. That's all she had ever been to him. A burden to be removed. No remorse, no guilt, just cold calculation. Tracy staggered back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had always suspected something, had always felt the distance between them growing, but she had never imagined this. Not in her worst nightmares. I'll never forgive you for this, Tracy said, the words cutting through the heavy silence between them. You've broken me. You've broken everything we had, and I will make sure everyone knows the truth about you. Christopher remained unfazed, his gaze still chillingly indifferent. Do what you have to do. It doesn't matter now. The weight of his words settled like a cold stone in her chest. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't worried. He didn't care. And that realization left Tracy with a bitter taste in her mouth. A realization that no matter how much she fought for justice, no matter how much she wanted him to feel the weight of what he had done, he was already too far gone. She turned her back on him, her body trembling, but she refused to give in to the tears threatening to spill. I'm done, she whispered, her voice hoarse with the weight of everything that had just shattered around her. As she stepped toward the door, Tracy knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. She had to keep moving forward, for herself, for the truth. Tracy's hands shook as she clutched the phone in her trembling fingers. The weight of the moment pressed down on her chest, the reality of her situation sinking in like a stone in her stomach. Her body still buzzed with the adrenaline of the struggle, but there was no time to rest. Her husband, her tormentor, was still in the house, and Tracy knew that without help, she might not make it out alive. She could hear him moving through the house, his footsteps slow but deliberate, a reminder that he wasn't finished. Her heart pounded in her chest as she dialed Kelly's number, her finger slipping on the screen. The call connected, but it felt like an eternity before Kelly answered. Tracy? Kelly's voice came through, muffled and filled with concern. What's going on? Are you okay? Tracy's throat tightened as she struggled to speak. Kelly, he tried to kill me. He's in the house. I need you to come now, please. He's not going to stop. Kelly's voice cracked with panic. What? Tracy, what happened? I'm on my way. Just stay on the phone, okay? I'm coming right now. Tracy closed her eyes, leaning against the doorframe for support. Her legs felt weak beneath her, but she couldn't afford to collapse. Christopher was still out there, somewhere in the house, and she had no idea what he was planning next. She heard him in the hallway, his movements deliberate, as though he was taking his time, savoring the fear in her voice. Tracy, Kelly's voice broke through the fog of her thoughts. Stay calm. Just breathe. I'm coming. I swear to God I'm coming. I'll call the police too. You're not alone. Tracy's body trembled as she heard Kelly's reassuring words, but the fear didn't subside. The thought of Christopher coming after her again, of him finishing what he had started, was too much to bear. She gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles white. I can't do this alone, Kelly, Tracy whispered, her voice barely audible. He's not the man I thought he was. He's gone, Kelly. I don't even know who he is anymore. Kelly's voice softened, trying to soothe her. Tracy, you're strong. You're stronger than you think. You're going to make it through this. Just hold on. I'm almost there. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. Tracy's breath quickened as she pressed herself against the wall, trying to stay out of sight. Her mind raced, thinking of every possible way to escape, to survive. But there was no place to run, no way out. She heard him now, just outside the door. Christopher's voice, low and calm, sent a shiver through her spine. You can't hide forever, Tracy. I'll find you. You're mine, and you always will be. Her heart froze in her chest. It wasn't just the words he said, it was the cold, unwavering confidence in his tone, the way he spoke, as though he had already won, already controlled everything. Tracy felt sick to her stomach. No, Tracy whispered under her breath, her grip on the phone tightening. I'm not yours anymore. The seconds seemed to stretch on endlessly. The door creaked as he moved closer, but just as his shadow crossed the threshold, the sound of tires screeching outside broke through the tension. Tracy's breath caught in her throat. Kelly had arrived. Get ready, Tracy. I'm right outside. Kelly's voice came through the phone, a lifeline in the chaos. Stay hidden. Don't let him see you. I'm calling 911. Tracy's body surged with relief and terror at once. Help was here, but it wasn't over. It couldn't be. Not yet. She pressed herself further into the corner, holding her breath, waiting for the next move. Christopher was still inside, but now, at least she wasn't alone. She had Kelly. She had the police on their way. She wasn't going to die here. "Just stay with me, Tracy. Stay with me," Kelly's voice came again, stronger this time, as Tracy's grip on her sanity tightened. This was her moment. She could escape. She could survive, but she had to stay quiet. She had to wait for Kelly. She had to hold on just a little longer. Tracy stood in the shadows, her body still shaking from the ordeal. She could hear Kelly's footsteps outside, getting closer, but her heart couldn't stop racing. She could feel every beat of it pounding in her chest, the sound deafening in her ears. The silence inside the house was heavy, like the calm before a storm. Her mind flashed back to the moment in the garage when Christopher's hands had been around her neck, when his eyes had been so cold, so detached. It wasn't just a simple fight. It wasn't a moment of rage that passed quickly. It was planned. He had made his decision. But Tracy couldn't afford to think about that right now. She had to focus. Kelly was on her way, but Christopher was still inside the house. Somewhere. She had to stay hidden. She couldn't let him find her. The sound of tires screeching outside pulled her back to the present. Kelly had arrived. Tracy pressed herself against the wall, trying to keep quiet. Her breath was still shallow, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter, hoping the knife she had grabbed earlier would provide some protection, though she knew deep down it was no match for Christopher's cold determination. Then, a door creaked. Her heart skipped a beat. There, just at the corner of the hallway, Christopher appeared. He wasn't rushing, wasn't frantic. He walked slowly, deliberately, his eyes scanning the space, as though looking for something, or someone. Tracy held her breath, her mind spinning. Should she confront him now, or wait for Kelly? What if Christopher had already found her? He paused. His gaze swept over the room, but he didn't look in her direction. His cold eyes darted toward the kitchen instead, moving in silence. Tracy's stomach twisted into a knot. What was he looking for? She watched him intently, the knife still clenched tightly in her hand. He had to know she was in here somewhere. But instead of coming toward her, he turned and walked toward the stairs, his footsteps slow and unhurried. He seemed confident, too confident. Tracy's mind raced. He wasn't going for the front door. He wasn't even looking for her. Instead, he was searching. For what? Suddenly she realized. He wasn't just hunting her. He was looking for something else. The truth of his betrayal was beginning to settle in her mind, and it was clearer than ever. He wasn't just trying to kill her. He was trying to cover his tracks. Tracy's heart skipped as a realization hit her. The hidden gun in the garage, the photographs of his mistress. There had to be more. The noose, the rope. He had planned this for weeks, maybe months. He wasn't just angry at her. He was getting rid of all evidence, not just her. He was preparing to disappear, to make sure no one could ever expose him. Her breath hitched as she heard a sound from upstairs, and she couldn't help but move closer to the foot of the stairs, still hidden in the dark. Christopher was rummaging through drawers. The house was eerily quiet apart from his movements. Then a sharp metallic sound echoed through the house, a drawer closing, a click of a lock. Tracy's blood ran cold. He had found something. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps grew louder and her body tensed. Kelly's voice rang through the hallway, faint at first but growing closer by the second. "Tracy!" Kelly called out, urgency in her voice. Tracy quickly took a step back, making herself as small as possible against the wall. "Tracy!" Kelly called again, her voice closer now. Tracy wanted to scream, to run toward her sister, but she had to be careful. Christopher was too close, and they couldn't afford to make a sound. Then, the moment she had feared arrived. Christopher's voice broke through the silence, calm but chilling. "I know you're here, Tracy." Tracy's heart sank. The hunt was on again. Kelly was only moments away, but Christopher had already cornered her. "Don't try to hide," he continued, his tone as cold as ever. "You can't run from me." For the first time since the encounter started, Tracy allowed herself to feel the full weight of her fear. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about exposing everything he had done, his betrayal, his lies, his cruelty. But just as she was about to react, she heard the sound of the front door opening. It was Kelly. Finally, the door slammed open, and Tracy knew the moment had come. Kelly was here, and Tracy wasn't alone anymore. "Tracy!" Kelly shouted as she rushed into the house. Christopher's head snapped toward the sound, his face contorting with a mix of annoyance and surprise. For a brief second, Tracy saw the fear in his eyes. He wasn't as in control as he had thought. "Stay back!" Tracy cried out, her voice sharp, full of raw panic and strength. "Don't come any closer." But Kelly had already made her move. She wasn't about to let Christopher have the upper hand. She rushed forward, determined to protect her sister. The air in the house was thick with tension as Christopher slowly turned his head toward the front door. Kelly's sudden entrance had broken the stillness, and Tracy felt the briefest flicker of hope ignite within her. But that hope was quickly replaced with fear, as she realized just how dangerous the situation had become. Christopher's expression shifted from cold indifference to something far more dangerous: agitation. His eyes darkened, and his body stiffened, as if he were calculating his next move. "Stay back," Tracy said, her voice trembling but firm, as she stepped forward to stand between Kelly and Christopher. She had no idea how they would make it through this, but she knew she couldn't let her sister face him alone. Kelly, on edge but resolute, stepped closer to Tracy, her eyes never leaving Christopher. She could sense the malice in the air, and her protective instinct kicked in full force. "Tracy, we need to get out of here now," Kelly said, her voice urgent but calm. "We can't stay here. He's not going to stop." But Tracy's feet were planted firmly on the floor. She wasn't going anywhere, not until Christopher was behind bars where he belonged. She glanced at Kelly, shaking her head. "We can't run anymore, Kelly. We have to make sure he faces the consequences for what he did." Christopher's lips curled into a thin smile, a smile that sent chills down Tracy's spine. It wasn't a smile of relief or affection, it was cold, calculating. "You think you can stop me?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "You think the police are going to save you?" "You're wrong, Tracy. I'm the one in control here. I always have been." The words hit Tracy like a slap in the face, but she refused to let him see her fear. "You're not in control anymore, Christopher. You're not the man I thought you were. And you're going to pay for what you've done," she said, her voice steady but filled with an underlying fury. Kelly stepped forward, her hands raised in an attempt to de-escalate the situation. "Christopher, just listen to us. You're going to make things worse. Please, just put down whatever you have in your hand." Christopher's gaze flicked to the knife Tracy had grabbed earlier, still clenched tightly in her hand. "You think that little knife is going to stop me?" he sneered, his confidence growing with each passing moment. Tracy's heart raced. She could see the man in front of her. The man she had once shared her life with was no longer someone she recognized. He had become something darker, more dangerous, and she wasn't sure what he would do next. But just as she thought he might lash out, something shifted. His shoulders slumped just slightly, as if the weight of the situation finally began to settle in. He took a step back, his eyes no longer burning with rage but with something else, something cold and resigned. "I didn't want it to end like this," Christopher muttered, almost to himself. His voice was quieter now, and there was a faint trace of regret buried beneath the anger. But Tracy wasn't fooled. "You didn't want it to end like this?" Tracy repeated incredulously. "You've been planning this for months, Christopher. You've been lying to me, cheating on me, and you've been plotting to kill me. Don't you dare pretend like this is just some accident." Christopher's eyes flicked to the ground, and for a moment it seemed as if he might collapse under the weight of his own guilt. But then, just as quickly, his gaze shot back up to meet hers and the coldness returned. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said again, this time more forcefully. "But now it doesn't matter anymore." Tracy's stomach turned. She could see now that Christopher wasn't just trying to escape the consequences of his actions, he was trying to justify them. And no matter how much he tried to convince himself that this was all somehow justified, Tracy knew the truth. He had betrayed her. He had tried to kill her, and now he was going to face the consequences. "You're done, Christopher," Tracy said, her voice unwavering. "You're not going to get away with this. Not this time." A tense silence filled the room. Tracy's words hung in the air, heavy and final. Christopher looked at her, and for a moment she could almost see the flicker of fear behind his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by something else: defiance. A defiance that Tracy knew she couldn't allow to stand. "You think you've won?" Christopher said, his voice low but steady. "You think the police will save you? You're wrong. You're nothing to me now." Tracy felt a knot tighten in her stomach, but she forced herself to stand tall, refusing to let him break her. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she said, her voice filled with quiet strength. "You've shown me who you really are, and I'm done being afraid." Christopher's expression darkened, but he said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. Tracy knew that the man she had once loved was gone. The man standing in front of her now was a stranger, someone she could no longer recognize, and she would do whatever it took to make sure he never hurt her or anyone else again. The courtroom was filled with a tense, almost suffocating silence as the judge entered. Tracy sat in the front row, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her heart hammering in her chest. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, but now that it was finally here, she couldn't shake the feeling that this would be the hardest part of the entire ordeal. The moment she would have to face Christopher in front of everyone. The man who had once been her husband, the man who had tried to end her life, now sitting in a defendant's chair. The judge called the court to order, and the sound of the gavel striking echoed through the room, signaling the start of the trial. Tracy forced herself to focus, her mind racing with thoughts of everything that had led to this point. The garage, the noose, the chilling confession. It all had to be laid out now, piece by piece, in front of the world. There would be no turning back. Christopher was seated at the defense table, his face expressionless, his hands folded in front of him. He didn't seem to acknowledge the gravity of the situation, as if this were just another day in court. But Tracy knew better. She could see the faint tremor in his hands, the slight twitch of his jaw. For the first time since the incident, she could see the cracks forming in his stoic facade. Her lawyer, a quiet but determined woman named Rebecca Harris, stood up and addressed the court, her voice calm and steady as she began to lay out the charges against Christopher. "Your Honor, the defendant, Christopher Chanowitz, stands accused of attempting to take the life of his wife, Tracy Chanowitz. On the evening of September 13, 1998, he intentionally attempted to strangle her in their garage with a noose that he had carefully set up. This was not a spur-of-the-moment act of anger, but a premeditated plan to end her life." Tracy's stomach turned as she listened to Rebecca's words. She had heard them before, of course. She had relived the nightmare in her mind countless times, but hearing them spoken aloud in front of so many people made everything real again. She could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her, the weight of their attention almost unbearable. The prosecutor continued presenting evidence: the rope, the pulley system, the photographs of Christopher's affair, the gun he had kept hidden in the garage. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of the man who had been her husband, someone she had trusted, someone she had built a life with, the man who had betrayed her, who had planned her death in cold blood. Christopher's defense lawyer, a tall man with a sharp suit and an even sharper tone, rose to his feet. He began to speak with the kind of polished arrogance that came from years of practice in the courtroom. "Your Honor, we do not deny that there was an altercation between my client and his wife on the night in question," he began, his voice smooth and controlled. "However, the defendant's actions were not intended to kill. This was a misunderstanding, a tragic incident fueled by emotions, but not one that warrants the extreme charges brought against him." Tracy's blood boiled as she listened to the defense attorney try to downplay what had happened, trying to reduce the attempted murder of her to a simple misunderstanding. The nerve of it. She wanted to stand up, to scream at the man, to demand that he look at the evidence and see her pain, but she stayed silent, keeping her focus on the trial, on what had to happen next. The defense attorney continued, questioning the validity of the evidence. He argued that the photographs of the affair were irrelevant to the case, that they were merely attempts to make Christopher appear worse than he was. He suggested that Tracy had fabricated the entire story, that she was lying to gain sympathy. It was a classic tactic: attack the victim, try to turn the tables, make them doubt their own truth. Tracy felt her chest tighten, the familiar rush of panic threatening to overwhelm her. She knew she had to stay strong, but the defense's words cut deep. Could they really make her doubt herself? Could they twist the truth into something unrecognizable? Rebecca Harris stood, her voice steady as she countered the defense's arguments. "Your Honor, the facts speak for themselves. This was not an accident. This was an act of premeditated violence. And the defendant's own words, his cold, calculated confession to his wife, further support the charges against him." Tracy's heart skipped a beat as the words "cold, calculated confession" rang in her ears. She had heard Christopher confess to trying to kill her in the garage, but hearing it spoken in court made it even more real. This wasn't just a nightmare she had been living through. This was a real, tangible thing, unfolding right before her eyes. Christopher's expression remained unreadable, but Tracy saw something flicker in his eyes. Was it regret? Fear? She couldn't tell, but she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of knowing how much he still affected her. The judge looked down at the table, his face grim as he called for a short recess before the next phase of the trial. Tracy stood up, her legs weak beneath her, but she held her head high. This was just the beginning. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. 100 characters. The courtroom buzzed with tension, the air thick with anticipation as the defense team prepared for their final attempt to sway the judge and jury. Tracy's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the moment almost unbearable. She had made it this far, surviving the terror, the betrayal, the endless nights of torment. Now it all came down to this. Christopher sat still at the defense table, his once confident demeanor starting to crack. The harsh reality of his situation was starting to settle in. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The photos of his affair, the gun hidden in the garage, the chilling confession he had made to Tracy, all of it painted a picture of a man who had meticulously planned his wife's murder. But Christopher's defense attorney, a seasoned lawyer with a sharp tongue and a calculating mind, wasn't going to go down without a fight. He rose from his seat and addressed the courtroom with the same polished arrogance that had characterized his every word so far. "Your Honor," the defense lawyer began, his voice smooth and measured, "we do not dispute the unfortunate events that transpired between the defendant and his wife. Yes, there was an altercation. Yes, it was a violent and regrettable moment. But it is not the crime that the prosecution claims it to be." Tracy's pulse quickened as the words began to sink in. This was it. The moment when everything she had fought for, everything she had suffered through, could be questioned and manipulated. The defense was trying to twist the truth, trying to paint Christopher's actions as a series of unfortunate mistakes rather than the premeditated attempt on her life it had been. "This was not an intentional act of murder," the lawyer continued, his eyes briefly glancing at Tracy. "What happened that night, though tragic, was a result of intense emotional distress. The defendant, Mr. Chanowitz, had been in an extramarital affair for over 6 years. He was caught in a cycle of guilt and confusion. He never intended for things to escalate this far. This is not a case of cold-blooded murder. It is a case of overwhelming personal turmoil." Tracy felt her stomach churn as she listened to the defense's attempt to humanize Christopher, to paint him as a man who had simply snapped under pressure. He had spent months, no, years planning the betrayal, the lie, and the murder, but now in the courtroom he was being portrayed as a victim of his own emotions. It was infuriating. The defense lawyer went on, listing Christopher's past as a loving husband, a devoted father, and a man under extreme stress. He talked about how his client had been caught between the love for his mistress and the responsibilities of his family, how he had been pushed to the brink, leading him to make terrible decisions. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we ask you to consider this. Was Mr. Chanowitz's intent to kill his wife truly clear in that moment? Or was he simply overwhelmed by emotions he didn't know how to control?" The defense lawyer's words hung in the air, trying to plant seeds of doubt. He wanted the jury to see Christopher as a man who was tragically caught in a storm of emotional chaos rather than the calculated individual he had truly been. Tracy clenched her fists in her lap, trying to hold back the rising tide of anger and disbelief. Her lawyer, Rebecca Harris, stood up to respond, and the courtroom went silent. She walked toward the jury, her gaze sharp, her stance firm. "Your Honor, members of the jury, we are not here to debate Mr. Chanowitz's emotional state. We are here to examine the facts, and the facts are clear. This was not a crime of passion or a momentary lapse of judgment. This was a planned and deliberate act of violence." Rebecca turned to face Christopher, her voice unwavering. "The defendant prepared a noose. He set up a pulley system. He waited for his wife to walk into that garage, blindfolded, thinking she was walking into a surprise. And when she did, he tried to kill her." The words were sharp, slicing through the defense's arguments. Tracy felt the weight of them. It was the truth that Christopher had spent months hiding from the world, and now it was being laid bare for everyone to see. "There is no excuse for what he did," Rebecca continued, her voice gaining strength. "There is no emotional turmoil that justifies premeditated murder. Christopher Chanowitz did not snap. He planned this. He executed it with cold precision." Tracy met Christopher's eyes across the courtroom. His face was hard, unreadable, but for the briefest moment she saw it, the fear. It wasn't the fear of getting caught, but the fear of finally being exposed for who he truly was. The mask he had worn for years was cracking, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The defense lawyer tried one final attempt, standing up quickly and raising his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask for your compassion. We ask you to see this man not as a criminal, but as a person who was lost, a person who made a terrible mistake under the pressure of his own emotions." But Rebecca wasn't finished. There is no room for compassion when it comes to attempted murder. The law does not excuse the calculated intent to take another person's life. Tracy felt a surge of hope as Rebecca's words echoed through the room. This was it, the turning point. The truth had been spoken, and there was no going back for Christopher now. Chapter 10. The Sentence. 2,950 characters. The courtroom was eerily quiet as the judge entered, his expression solemn. Tracy sat in the front row, her fingers trembling slightly as she gripped the armrest. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for, dreading and yet hoping for all at once. She had survived the nightmare, but the true test was yet to come, the moment when Christopher's fate would finally be sealed. Christopher was seated at the defense table, his eyes fixed ahead, his face an unreadable mask. His expression had remained unchanged throughout the trial, cold and detached, as if he were a spectator rather than a defendant. Tracy had grown used to seeing that face, but now it disgusted her. There was no remorse in him, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. Just a man who thought he could control everything, who thought he could escape the consequences of his actions. The judge's voice broke the silence. "Mr. Chanowitz, you have been convicted of attempted second-degree murder with additional charges of unlawful possession of a weapon and endangerment. It is now time for sentencing." Tracy's heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was the moment of justice, the moment when Christopher would finally pay for what he had done, for the lies, for the betrayal, for the premeditated attempt on her life. The judge paused for a moment, his gaze moving between Christopher and Tracy. "This court has heard all the evidence. We have listened to the victim's testimony, and we have reviewed the defendant's actions. There is no doubt that Mr. Chanowitz's attempt to end his wife's life was deliberate and cold-blooded. His actions were not those of a man under duress, but of a man who had made a calculated decision to end the life of someone who had trusted him." Tracy's breath caught in her throat as the judge's words sank in. This was it. There was no turning back now. The truth had been spoken, and Christopher was being held accountable. "Mr. Chanowitz," the judge continued, "you have shown no remorse for your actions. You have attempted to justify your behavior, and have attempted to manipulate the court by minimizing the severity of your crime. Your lack of accountability and the severity of your actions leave this court with no choice but to impose a significant sentence." Tracy's chest tightened as she listened to the judge. The words were final. The sentencing was coming. But even though she had fought so hard to get to this moment, there was still a part of her that couldn't fully embrace the victory. Nothing would change what Christopher had done to her. Nothing would undo the fear, the trauma, the pain. The judge turned to face Christopher, his expression unwavering. "Christopher Chanowitz, you are hereby sentenced to 15 years in prison for the attempted second-degree murder of your wife. Additionally, you will serve concurrent sentences for unlawful possession of a weapon and endangerment. You will serve this sentence without the possibility of parole." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and Tracy's breath escaped in a slow exhale. She had been waiting for this moment, had been working toward this moment for so long, but hearing the finality of the sentence, still felt surreal. It was over. Christopher would never be able to hurt her again. But as the gavel came down, as the judge pronounced the final judgment, Tracy couldn't help but feel the sting of something else, a deep, hollow ache that she had been carrying for so long. Justice had been served, but the scars of the past would remain with her forever. Christopher's face remained blank, his eyes distant. Tracy couldn't tell if he was in shock or simply indifferent. There was no emotion, no anger, no regret, just the same coldness that had defined him throughout the trial. The deputies stepped forward, ready to escort him from the courtroom, but as they moved toward Christopher, Tracy's eyes met his for a brief, fleeting moment. And for the first time, she saw something in his eyes, something that wasn't the usual emptiness. Was it fear? Was it regret? Or was it just a fleeting glimpse of vulnerability? She couldn't tell, But in that moment, she felt a strange sense of closure. As Christopher was led away, Tracy stood tall, her legs shaking but her resolve firm. The courtroom was silent, but inside, Tracy felt the weight of everything that had happened beginning to lift. The years of lies, the betrayal, the terror. It was all finally coming to an end. She had survived. She had fought for her life, for the truth, and now she was free. The gavel came down again, and the court session was over. Tracy turned to Kelly, who was waiting for her with open arms. Kelly stepped forward, and without a word, they embraced, the unspoken bond between them stronger than ever. As they walked out of the courtroom together, Tracy felt the weight of the past slowly begin to fade. She had won, and now for the first time in a long time she could finally start to heal. What do you think of Christopher Chanowitz's actions and the chilling events that unfolded? Do you think justice was truly served? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story shocking and want to hear more true crime stories like this, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for more gripping tales from real-life cases.